I think about words quite a bit. I talk about words quite a bit. Maybe that's because of my job. I read a lot of words and I'm constantly thinking about words and where they come from and what they mean. Words are one of those things that have a strange dichotomy to them. On one hand, they're incredibly powerful. We use them to communicate complex thoughts and ideas, emotions and feelings. Or think about the incredibly impactful markers in human history that we can recognize with just a few choice words, like, I have a dream. Immediately, the odds are that you know exactly who it was who said those words. You know about the historical setting and the situation in which they were said, the impact that those words have had on the direction of history from that point forward. Or what about these words? One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Again, odds are that you know exactly who it was that said that, where he was standing when he said those words. You might even be able to hear the crackle of the recording in the back of your head. Gigantic, monumental moments in history that we can recall with just a few of those things that we call words. On the other hand, though, we tend to try and undermine their value, or at least we underestimate their value. They're just words, we tell ourselves, no big deal. In fact, there's this phrase we toss around all the time. It's meant to instill in us a kind of toughness and strength, a resiliency, and yet it could not be any more untrue. It might be one of the most untrue statements around. We say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I can almost guarantee you've said this phrase at one time or another. Maybe it was as a child in the schoolyard, or maybe you said it to yourself as an adult to try and instill some of that strength and bravery in yourself. Or maybe you said it to someone else as a retort when they tried to use harmful words against you. A stick or a stone, an action can cause me physical harm, but words can't. And the words that come out of my mouth, they can't really do any damage. After all, they're just words, right? Last week we read about this really deep idea from Jesus. We read about how he says he's not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but that he's come to fulfill them. We talked about how the backstory, about how the heart of the matter changes things for Jesus. And here in these next few passages, Jesus is going to give us some concrete examples of exactly what he means. We'll begin today with the big one, probably the most well-known of the Ten Commandments and probably the most no-brainer law in existence. Today, we'll learn what Jesus thinks about murder. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell." What Jesus is addressing here in this text is a fact of human nature. That fact being that anytime a boundary is set, we're going to see how far we can go to push that boundary without getting in trouble. It starts within us at an early age. As toddlers, we heard the rules and warnings from our parents, and we tested them to see how much we could get away with. But in reality, it never stops. We did the same thing as teenagers, and we do the same thing now as adults. You know in your mind how far over the speed limit you're willing to set your cruise control, right? This is the same situation we're dealing with here. The Pharisees, the rabbis, and the teachers of the law were all seeking to answer the same question. What exactly does it take to fulfill the sixth commandment? And most of the teachings limited the law to exactly what it said. Technically, the law says, do not murder. So out of anger or vengeance, as long as you didn't murder, you fulfilled that commandment. Jesus teaches us that the real interpretation of this law is much, much broader. It encompasses much more than the legal definition of murder. It involves our actions, our words, and even our thoughts. Jesus goes all the way back to our innermost thoughts and feelings. He cuts straight through to the root of the problem. Jesus says murder starts with anger. And unless we want to be subject to judgment, we need to eradicate that anger. Long before murder enters the thought process, we find anger. And what begins as interior anger soon manifests itself outward in different outward expressions. Something that might come off first as juvenile or even harmless. Jesus mentions here name calling. Jesus throws out two examples, raka and fool. Raka is probably an Aramaic insult meaning empty. Reflect with me on that for just a minute. Reflect with me about that insult and what it's saying. That one hit me this week. To call another person empty is such a deep, cutting insult. And while I've never said raka to anyone, I've said moron, I've said idiot, I've said stupid. Many times we don't stop and think about what it means when we say those things. We don't think about how that's forming our minds and forming the minds of others. A.B. Bruce writes that raka is a term that expresses contempt for a person's head, and fool is a term expressing contempt for a person's heart or for their character. And so what exactly are we doing when we're levying insults on others? We're reducing their worth in our minds. We're categorizing them as less than human. That's not a person who cut me off in traffic. That's an idiot. And here's the rub. Subtly, subconsciously, when I've reduced someone from a child of God to whatever insult I've decided is appropriate in the moment, it allows me to treat them as something lesser. I can now act in ways toward them that I would not and could not otherwise. I've taken the humanness. I've taken the personhood from them. And now we're starting to see why to Jesus, these are similar acts. If we were in a classroom right now, and I asked us to share a time that someone has hurt you with words, every single one of us would have a story to tell. Some of them might even be from a long, long time ago. I can still remember every word and the inflection in the voice of an insult that I received in the 5th grade. Our words carry meaning. Our words carry weight. And that meaning and weight can have some serious longevity. We might say sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But that's not true for you. And it's not true for those who are the targets of our insults. Jesus says this is not just about murder. This is about how we view other people. This is about our relationships with other children of God and how we treat them. And how important is that to God? How important is our relationship with our fellow human beings? Jesus is about to tell us, and it might surprise you. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you've paid the last penny. Yes, we read that first part right. Jesus says that if someone were worshiping, if someone were offering their gift at the altar, and then they remembered that there was some conflict between them and a brother or sister, that they needed to stop right there. Stop right then. Leave the gift, Jesus says. Leave worship and go and be reconciled. Be reconciled first and then come back to worship. He continues, if you're on the way to court, settle it on the way. Both of these instances seem to imply that the reader is the wrongdoer here. If you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, and then he continues, if someone is taking you to court, the message is one of peacemaking. You might remember from the Beatitudes that Jesus calls peacemakers blessed. Swallow my pride, seek reconciliation, and in doing so, honor the value of the child of God beside me. The way of the cross is radical reconciliation, both in our relationship with God and in our relationships with each other. You might remember that a few months ago, we talked a little bit about the history of this whole sacrificial system. There are some really long, dry, detailed descriptions in the Old Testament that outline the rules for these sacrifices. Who is to do the sacrificing? When to do the sacrificing? Where to sacrifice? What to bring to the sacrifice? How exactly to do the sacrificing? But pretty quickly, it seems something goes wrong in this system. In the prophets, we have God saying things like, even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. So what happened? People had become really good at making the right sacrifices. They knew the system in and out. They had the worship service down to an art. A sacrifice here, a couple of prayers and a song here, and then a sacrifice, and we're on our way. They were fulfilling the letter of the law. But it appears there is a vast difference in living by the letter of the law and being transformed by the heart of it. The goal of this sacrificial system is the same goal that Jesus is proposing here: transformation of the heart. That the love of Christ would overwhelm us and transform us into little Christs in the world. That it would seep so far down into our bones that it's not enough simply not to murder, but that we would begin to value and respect the human being beside us. Even when we're angry, that it would change us so radically that we would refuse to even call other people names, and that we might leave worship to go and be reconciled. So here's a challenge for this week. Take note of how we react in anger. What do we call other people? How do we act toward them? And how do we remove value from them when we're angry with them? And then go be a peacemaker. Actively seek reconciliation with those that we might have wronged. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.